Welcome to the Take the North podcast. I'm David Haugh from the 670 The Scores Mully and Haugh Show. Dan Wiederer is from the Chicago Tribune covering the Bears. I guess I should say welcome back to the Take the North podcast. It's been a little while, Dan. You filled in. Nice job with the Brian Baldinger stuff. Interesting draft look by Baldy as always, and there's been a lot of stuff going on. But in Chicago this week, it was the arrival of Caleb Williams, and I think that is the biggest story Bears-wise, is at least the first week in April.
And the last week in March and the 7 weeks preceding that and into December. It's been the biggest story on the radar for a long time. And this is the next advancement in that story with Caleb Williams essentially completing his top 30 visit at Halas Hall and really getting toward the finish line of the getting to know you process that the Bears have had underway really since they broke the ice with him at the scouting combine in late February. And this just felt like almost a formality at this point, because you just do sense that there's a lot of comfort building between the two sides and that we're just essentially waiting for the marriage ceremony on April 25th when the draft goes down in Detroit.
Before we get to some of the specifics and questions about Caleb Williams and also getting to what you talked about with Ryan Poles at the owners meetings last week when you had a one-on-one with him, couple of things about who else visited Halas Hall, part of the top 30 visits, and they had a week full of visitors, including Rome Odunze, the Washington wide receiver, and Dallas Turner, the edge rusher. I wonder about those two prospects in terms of what it says about the Bears' potential interest in them with the number 9 overall pick, as well as the absence of some names that you might expect, some offensive tackles. I don't know if you have access or you're, when does this, where does this go next? Is next week they're hosting more, but Odunze and Turner, those are two of the names that caught a lot of attention this week.
Well, one thing for our audience to understand is that you're only allowed 30 of these on-campus visits, which is why they're called the top 30 visits. And teams use these for varying reasons. There's oftentimes that a team will have everything it wants to know about a prospect learned before they even get to the stage, and they don't feel like wasting a visit on a guy that they already feel like they have the full comprehensive report on. So there's never a direct correlation between interest and the actual visit. Now, that said, obviously this number 9 pick, as you know, is really, really compelling for the organization. It really puts the Bears in a position to land another impact starter immediately after drafting what they hope will be their franchise quarterback at number 1 overall. And so when you talk about Odunze, when you talk about Dallas Turner, you talk about two things that Matt Eberflus has stressed during this process. He wants to find guys that affect the quarterback or help the quarterback. So you get a receiver, a guy who can catch passes and help your quarterback that way, or you get a guy that can put the other team's quarterback in duress, like a Dallas Turner. So those guys will be part of the menu that Ryan Poles wants to choose off of when he gets to number 9, an hour or so into the draft on April 25th. And it's understandable why the Bears are doing their full process and homework on guys like that.
But what about offensive tackle? Do you think that Joe Alt, do you think that Fashanu, do you think that those guys will take the top 30 visits to the Bears? And if they don't, can we read anything into that?
Oh, I wouldn't read too much into it, because I do think that they are going to be exploring the offensive tackle market. We do know they had a great presence out at Oregon State for Fuaga's pro day earlier in the offseason. We know that Chris Morgan was, in person and running the workouts in South Bend when Joe Alt had his pro day. There's a lot of different forums and fashions that the pre-draft vetting process can take. We'll see who else comes through the building. We know we don't always get the full list and the full itinerary of guys who have come and haven't come. And so, I think some of this stuff, when the draft ends and we get a chance to kind of zoom out and scale back on what all happened, you start to gather more of that intel. I wouldn't get too tied up in knots about who's been through, who's been reported through, who hasn't. Just understand that, again, like as you and I have been emphasizing now for weeks, like this is an unbelievable time in Bears history where you have the number 1 pick and then you have another top 10 pick. And the idea that these two guys are going to become the cornerstone and the engine of what you hope is your next drive toward multiple championships, division, conference, maybe even a silver trophy that can someday be presented. This is it. So like, you want to make sure that you dial in on guys that you believe can fit everything you want to do in that regard.
All right, so let's zero in on the guy who is most responsible for that kind of expectation, and that's Caleb Williams. I was amused by the reports about Caleb Williams' trip to Lake Forest. I almost said Chicago, but I didn't say Chicago because it was Lake Forest, and they didn't take him to the steakhouse in Chicago. There was some confusion on that, even some debate in some circles about why wouldn't they take him to Chicago. But Caleb Williams arrived, and the night that he went out to dinner with Bears brass, it seems like there were two parties of
Yeah.
Bears personnel going out to different restaurants. What do you know about that decision to do it that way? And what did you think that Caleb Williams was apparently with the A team, if you will, the Bears brass, and maybe some teammates, some Bears teammates? Anything about that stand out, Dan?
I just want to know what the B team dinner looked like and who all was in attendance at that one. Um, Look, like this is part of your process, and obviously dinner is a part of that. Given that Bears headquarters is in Lake Forest, the convenience of having the dinner out that way, where you can have a very nice meal at a very nice restaurant and have a very nice ambiance. There'll be plenty of time for Caleb Williams to visit the uh, dining establishments in downtown Chicago over the next 20 years, presumably. And so they'll be able to enjoy some of those hot spots as they go. I did think it was notable in some of the reports that have come out that it wasn't just the higher ups at Hallis Hall that were dining with Caleb Williams. That reportedly DJ Moore was part of a group of players, Tyreek Stevenson part of a group of players that spent some time with the guy that the Bears have zeroed in on as their future quarterback. And I think that's just a notable touch. We've talked about touches all through this process of trying to get a sense for how he connects with not only the teammates that he's had at USC, but the teammates that he's going to join at Hallis Hall. And so you would imagine you got some feedback from those guys. I can tell you, David, that they dined at Sophia Steak in Lake Forest, which also has a restaurant in Wilmette that my wife and I have gone on each of our past two anniversaries. And so I can vouch that it is a very good establishment. And hopefully Caleb Williams enjoyed his meals as much as I have the last couple times I've visited.
I know some people that want to know if he ordered steak, fish, or a salad. So I think that there's the level of detail that people want to know about this visit is very, very telling and also kind of predictable. But I think the biggest thing, Dan, in terms of what the news of this week was that he canceled the visits, so he's not taking any other visits, or at least there are none scheduled right now. So Caleb Williams must have gotten some indication from the Bears that this is not going to go any other way. So why bother visiting Washington, visiting New England, visiting wherever else? This is just a matter of it's inevitable. In 3 weeks, he's going to be a Bear.
Given the strong vibes that people like you and I have to lead us toward that conclusion, I would imagine the vibes that Caleb Williams has gotten in recent weeks would be a little stronger even still. This is it, right? Like it just feels like a fait accompli at this point, and we are down the road now of finishing off what we long anticipated was going to happen in this storyline.
Let me ask you one question before we get to your interview with Ryan Poles and some of the things he added to the mix in Orlando. So it has been suggested, Mike Florio put it out in Pro Football Talk. Technically, if the Bears wanted to sign Caleb Williams to a contract, they could. Right now, the NFL rules permit that. It doesn't mean he could participate in the offseason activities, which begin the offseason program on April 15th. Pros and cons of that possibility, I think it's probably semantics, Dan. I don't know what you would gain. I think the NFL encourages teams to wait just because there's that drama of still getting the card and reading it. So, what did you think of that report and that possibility? What did you think of that possibility?
No, I was just going to say, second silliest thing by a country mile suggested by Pro Football Talk in the last month or so. The first one being when Mike Florio suggested that the Bears exiled Justin Fields like the Browns did, or like the Texans did to Deshaun Watson, while they sought a trade partner for him for an entire year. That's a whole nother podcast we could do. In this case, I look like since the slotted rookie wage scale went into effect, there's really not a lot that goes into these negotiations for these picks like there was way back in the day. And so there's just nothing to trying to sign a guy in advance of the draft. Sure, you could do it. What if you do it and Caleb Williams goes out and gets hit by a bus before April 25th? Well, now what has happened? So there's little advantage to it. There's really no reason it even became a discussion point. It just felt like one of those things that slow news day. Let's find a name that draws a lot of traffic. Let's find a topic that can draw eyeballs and write something about it. I kind of rolled my eyes and laughed at it because I don't think there was anything to it.
So going back to the owners' meetings in Orlando, you had an opportunity to sit down with Ryan Poles, discuss a variety of things, but specifically you talked about Caleb Williams and the whole process as we get closer to the draft.
Very specifically, I had a little bit more than 20 minutes with Ryan at the Ritz-Carlton in Orlando. And when I sat down with him, I can't remember if I mentioned this last week when we talked, I said, when I was on the plane flying to Orlando and writing down my list of topics and questions, I had 72 questions written down that I wanted to ask Ryan Poles. That's how much is going on with this franchise right now. I decided to narrow my scope for that 20 plus minutes to all Caleb Williams all the time questions. And so we were able to cover a significant amount of ground in terms of the things he's learned during this pre-draft process, from the combine to the pro day visit to LA to what he was anticipating at that time being the top 30 visit at Hallis Hall. I think Ryan has been very refreshed, I think, in the way that his connection with Caleb Williams has clicked pretty quickly. He's not the most significant person in the building, obviously, David, that needs to have that connection. You would hope that Caleb finds similar connections with his head coach, Matt Eberflus, his offensive coordinator and play caller, Shane Waldron, with obviously some of the teammates that are going to have to elevate him, and he likewise, vice versa. But I do think it's notable that the general manager and the quarterback seem to be seeing eye to eye right now and developing a relationship. One of the things that Ryan has talked about throughout the pre-draft process is really, as he talked about evaluating quarterbacks and in particular in this dynamic, was learning how they handle pressure. And he said it on multiple occasions where he wants to learn how a quarterback handles pressure. And then he's followed it up by saying, I also want to get a feel for how they'll handle pressure in our city, which I think there's a distinction there, right? Because we've lived a different world, and Ryan Poles has been part of that world for the last couple of years of understanding how supercharged the quarterback evaluation in Chicago is and has become. And so trying to figure out how a guy is going to assimilate into that and handle that and do that is a very big deal. And here's some of what Ryan had to say on that topic.
Mentioned multiple times feeling out how a prospect, specifically a quarterback, will handle pressure. And then you've also said in this city.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a distinction that you've felt in the few years you've been here. How do you kind of characterize the difference of what this landscape of Chicago will be?
Yeah, we have a passionate fan base that has gone through a lot of adversity for a long period of time. It gets emotional. And I've felt that, it's the highs and the lows of, you're the best thing ever, and then like you're the worst ever.
Right.
So you got to be able to stay right in the middle, never get too high, never get too low, and have the internal confidence not to be pushed up and down by the noise and social media and all of those things. Because I honestly feel, and I just relate to myself, if you make decisions or you play off of emotions to prove people wrong, and you get outside of what you do really well, I think those are the critical mistakes that set you back. And then you're either quarterback or GM or head coach, you're gone, and somebody else comes in, and the cycle just goes over and over and over again. So I've been really, really intentional myself, and I know, whoever comes in here, and if it's Caleb, has awareness of that.
How do you drill into forecasting how a guy's going to respond to that?
Yeah, you got to look at just past behavior and past struggles. Even if they weren't handled in the best way, you want to just hear the guys take ownership of where they came up short. If they're blind to it or deny it, but you see it very clearly, that would be a concern of mine.
He told a LA Times reporter right after the season ended that he thought 2023 was going to be his most important season of football. Right. And I thought that was really cool to hear a guy that coming off a year that didn't meet expectations to say, okay, well, now I got to figure out what I did to grow, where I screwed up. How have you kind of drilled down on that and learning what exactly he took away from a year that didn't clear the bar.
Yeah, I think it was the adversity part, the thick skin.
Do you think he has that thick skin, or is it still developing?
I know he does, but I also think there's room for growth there too. And he's been in the limelight. He's been in the spotlight. So I know that that's developing at a really good rate that I feel comfortable about. And I think the other thing too is he has really, really high expectations of himself.
Yeah.
Like when he talks about that year, like he wanted to win the Heisman back to back. He wanted to go to the championship, playoffs and win a championship, and that was his mindset. So when that started to deteriorate, that was really hard for him.
Yeah.
And what I expressed to him, he's expressed is, maybe that was actually the best thing for him.
Yeah.
Because he's going to get that in the league.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. So, as as we are prone to do, you listen to those clips and you look for, all right, what did he say that's going to stand out to, as you said, people who are familiar with this market, have covered a lot of general managers and quarterbacks in this market.
Mm-hmm.
What stood out to me was, of all the things he said, it was very interesting, and I think he covered a lot of ground. But what made me want to ask more of a follow-up after he was finished would have been, what do you mean by room for growth when it comes to having thin skin or not having thick skin? What examples have you seen in the pre-draft process that made you answer it that way? Because, do we parse the language? Of course. But I do wonder if they found examples of him being overly sensitive to something, or where he didn't rise to the occasion. Because you ask a question like that, it's natural. You do have to be oblivious to a lot of things in a market like Chicago. I would like to know where they found evidence that might be a concern in Caleb Williams.
Yeah, no, there's a good follow-up questions, and I think as we get further along, we need to get more specifics on some of the things that Ryan's talking about there, and that Caleb has talked to the Bears about. The three words that struck me in the first part of the answer to the first question there was, Ryan said it gets emotional. He has had firsthand experience for 2+ years in Chicago of seeing what emotion in this city looks like. Caleb is known as an emotional guy. So how do you have an emotional guy in an emotional environment and still have a shock system that provides that equilibrium that Ryan's talking about having? Now, listen, I think that the Bears have identified a maturity in Caleb throughout the pre-draft process of understanding that there probably were some things in 2023 at USC that he wishes he had handled better. Things that he will need to handle differently when he's in an NFL locker room versus a college environment. We've talked about that previously. You're going into an environment where you're expected to lead grown men. These are grown ass men who have 2 and 3 kids and they've got a livelihood, and they just don't have time for drama and emotional episodes and whatever it may be. And so one of the things that Ryan said within that clip was even if a guy hasn't handled something the right way, you want to hear that he takes ownership of that and doesn't deny it. It sounds like they've gotten comfort that Caleb hasn't run away from some of the criticism that's come his way in that regard. Now, again, you're dead on and saying, look, like, we've got to continue to press for more specifics to understand that a little bit better. But it's certainly, I think, another indicator that Ryan's awareness is heightened in terms of all of the different things that need to be in place to be successful as a quarterback in the NFL, in Chicago in the NFL, and his willingness to kind of really explore a lot of those areas, I think, should leave Bears fans pretty optimistic and heartened that he's exploring this from so many different angles.
No doubt about it. I mean, they're going to know what they have, and they've pretty much exhausted every avenue. And you go back, the progress they've made since we started talking about the vetting process and what they might find and all of the red flags that are potentially going to appear. All I think is one very simple thing. What evidence or examples are you referring to in your head when you say that he still has room for growth when it comes to handling these kinds of things, or not having a thick enough skin? And if he answers the question that way, transparently, I think it starts to give you a better idea about what they have and what they're concerned about.
Well,
He's a
look, I
rookie.
mean, yeah, and I think you would be capable of connecting the dots to the crying in the stands
Yeah,
with his mom after a loss, the post game press conferences that he's either skipped out on or been sort of despondent and said that he wants to go home and cuddle with his dog. There's certain things that aren't going to play in the cauldron that is the NFL, and so
sure.
those are probably examples where you tell them, listen, like you're going to have to, even if you're feeling that turbulence inside, you're going to have to toughen up on the outside so that it gives the outside world the appearance that you've got everything under control.
You know what the best part about this conversation is, or at least their pre-draft process as it regards this is that you're talking largely about maturity, not ability. You're talking about
No
him
doubt.
being intangibly ready for this role, not tangibly ready for this role, because you watch the tape, you see the throws, you read reports about the velocity on his throws as measured in metrics that we've never heard of before by Albert Breer, and you hear he looks the part, and he makes all the throws that make you believe that the Bears are about to add a rare passer to the offensive huddle. And that's the best part. The maturity thing, I mean, you can coach that. You can see, just age will improve that. And those are the kinds of things I think you can surround him with players the way the Bears have. I mean, this is a ready-made situation for a rookie quarterback to come into, surrounded by guys. They're ready for this in a way they weren't a year ago ready to take on any immaturity from any rookie.
No question. And one of the things that Ryan has highlighted, not only with Caleb, but with us in the media, is that you want to be able to show a quarterback examples on the front end of how you have his best interest in mind. Well, there's no better example than trading a 4th round pick to get a 10,000 yard receiver that comes to the guy's pro day, and gives the guy an instant feeling of comfort. Like, okay, like these people are genuinely interested in bringing out my best as soon as possible. And they're showing me tangible evidence of doing that. I'll pivot here to I was very satisfied with that kind of back and forth that we just listened to. There's a question I asked Ryan that I'm not necessarily as satisfied with, and I wanted to get your take on this because Chicago's grandest fear is repeating history. And when I talk about repeating history, I talk about drafting a quarterback high, putting him with a coaching staff that isn't on solid ground, and then a year into his career hitting the reboot button and saying, hey, kid, learn a new offense. Here's a new coaching staff. Here's a new head coach. Here's a new play caller. Get going. Mitch Trubisky went through it. Justin Fields went through it. The fear here in Chicago is that Caleb Williams will have to go through it. So here was a little bit of the back and forth of that part of the discussion that I had with Ryan Poles in Florida.
Chicago's grandest fear is repeating. Quarterback comes in after a year, coaching staff gets blown out. They got to restart. How do you allay that concern that's going to kind of linger for a while?
Yeah, I think it's one. Yeah, I struggle, and that's why I'm so convicted about it. When we talk about coaching records, we throw the 3-win season in, and it's hard to judge. That's the same thing I talk about with Justin.
Yeah.
It's the trauma from the past that gets leaked into the situation. So I kind of see year 2 as the true reflection of what we got now at the talent. So I just think that it's kind of easy to see that where it's trending.
Yeah.
But even more so on the offensive staff part of things, try to be intentional with adding guys that I think can also be coordinators, just in case your coordinator gets bumped up. I think that's one of the big concerns. So you try to add levels to that to protect yourself, to make sure there's a level of consistency at least for the first couple of years, and then in my mind, if you get to year 4 or 5, it's really the quarterback's offense anyways.
Right. So for an outsider that says, you don't want to inhibit a rookie quarterback with win or else pressure that his head coach is feeling, how do you characterize what it is in your building going into 2024?
Yeah, I obviously you never know year to year, but I just have a ton of confidence that we're not going to be in that situation. There's going to be stability.
Talking year 4 and 5. Wow. That's confidence. And I like the way that he also let people know that he's hiring people with that possibility in mind. So the expectation of success there is what stood out to me. And I don't think you can go about it any other way.
You can't, but there's part of me that wants a little bit firmer assurance that Matt Eberflus isn't on the hot seat. We got to the end of last season believing that Matt Eberflus was on the hot seat. The Bears did little to dispel that notion, given that it took them 3+ days to finally come to their final conclusions on what the coaching staff was going to look like for 2024. And so, look, like Ryan has been pretty forthright in voicing his confidence in who Matt Eberflus is as a coach. And you heard it in that clip where he said it's easy to see where it's trending, and feeling like last year when they kind of stabilized some things and gave him some more players to work with, that the Bears found their stride and started to look more like a competitive football team at the end of the year. But I would point out that loss in Cleveland was pretty dramatic. I would point out that loss in Green Bay was pretty jarring, that there were indications that not only haven't you cleared any significant hurdle yet, but you haven't shown that you're not going to face plant directly into the hurdle and walk away with 5 chipped teeth. Right. So like, this is kind of the fear that is lingering, and in Caleb Mania and all the hype that's led up to the draft, I think we've kind of lost sight of the conversation that we were having all through the month of January, which is this coaching staff with Matt Eberflus at the top of it the one that you really want to have the steering wheel when you're putting Caleb Williams into the picture?
He didn't sound like he was anticipating a win or else season. He sounded like he was stockpiling offensive play callers so there would be continuity moving forward in year 4 or year 5. And if he's talking about year 4 or year 5, I don't think he's talking about a coaching change.
He's not. But what happens if Denver 2023 happens again? What happens if Cleveland happens again? What happens if they go to Ford Field and blow a 2-score lead in the final 5 minutes again? You know what I mean? Like, you've lived this. You know how quickly the conversation changes. I understand a general manager looking at it through an optimistic and confident lens, but like, I still have that fear underlying in the environment where you say, like, I can't tell our audience that Matt Eberflus 100% is going to be the coach in 2025, and you would like to have that assurance in some way, shape, or form.
I don't disagree with the premise, but I would only push back it one way. I think that the presence of Caleb Williams doesn't necessarily remove the pressure from Matt Eberflus as much as it intensifies it. And I think that if you're at the point where you're changing coaches after one season, head coaches, then you're doing so because something's gone wrong. It's not great, horribly wrong. But I think that I would rather have the answer at quarterback than a head coach right now, if I had to choose one in this offseason. And you'd like to have both, ideally. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but at least it appears that they've answered the most difficult question in their franchise. And now if they can get them to marry together and both have success, great. But if not, they want to clean house after one season, that's fine, because you know what? You better feel urgency every year, because now you got the quarterback. And if you don't believe it, we're going to keep reminding you each and every day. So
you got the quarterback on his rookie deal. Yeah. So one last passage I wanted to play for you, and we'll just listen to it because I think, as we get to the end, it points you in the direction of the conclusion that we're all trying to essentially put in bold ink and etch into cement. But here's a last little exchange of Ryan Poles talking about the evaluation of Caleb Williams and where it's leading the team.
You talk about feeling out a guy's ability to handle expectation, pressure, the fishbowl. Mm-hmm. Do you test? Are there specific things you do to drill in on that? Because it is a big forecast, more than a test that you grade.
Yeah, we have some assessments that we use. The league has one that they do as well. But really, that's probably the hardest part. And so you use just past experiences that they've gone through to kind of be in that space. Fortunately for these quarterbacks, especially that are on top of the college world, they've lived in that space. Now, if they haven't, those are the things you got to work through and it's hard to predict.
Yeah.
But we do have some assessments that we use on staff too. I mean, we try to be consistent with that.
Two last things really quickly. The spectacle part of things. Like he's going to bring kind of almost a LeBron-like spotlight when he comes in the league. How do you prepare yourself for something that is more than just your everyday Joe quarterback?
Yeah, Kevin and I have talked about it. Like, we're going to be very intentional with how, as an organization, we protect our players, specifically ones that come in with this kind of wake that comes behind them, to make sure that we keep the main thing, because this game is extremely hard, especially as we're in a rookie year, especially going from your last season to combine training to visits. Like, it's a long season. So as an organization, we're going to be very intentional with how we handle all of our players, but specifically the quarterback, to make sure that they're insulated and they can focus on what they need to focus on, and then we'll build off of that as we go.
This will be complicated. And I guess the last thing, Ben Simmons said, I asked him what advice he'd give teams that were coming fishing on Caleb trying to get information. He said, I would just tell him, trust your gut. Get around him and trust your gut. What's your gut? What is your gut telling you here? As we, kind of pivot into the month where you might.
Yeah, as we go, it just feels better and better.
Yeah.
About where we're headed, and him specifically. So again, we got a couple more touch points, but before I think I'm going to be like, okay, we're good. Let's just move to we're on 9. But it feels good.
And that was before the visit. Feels good.
Yeah, the visit is one of those touch points that they wanted to get through. But yeah, certainly they feel really good. We should feel really good that we're getting to the end of this long journey that leads us there, and then we'll be obviously glued to our seats, seeing what's next.
Good questions. I have as many. If I had to rank my doubt, if I did a power rankings of doubt heading into this draft or heading into this offseason, and it would be doubts about the Bears' ability to do what he just described, prepare to welcome a superstar, potentially a potential superstar with all of the LeBron-like following that you referenced. I'm not sure that the Bears are ready to do that as an organization, or I think they need to work on that more and prepare for that more. And I question whether they can do that more than I have any football questions. I think that organizationally, I have not seen evidence that they're ready for this as much as I have seen evidence that from a football standpoint, they're ready for this.
To quote Matt Nagy, that's real, right? Like, that's very real what you're describing there. And that's a test that the organization is going to have to take. And Ryan at least is aware. Like, he doesn't seem like he's oblivious to the idea. He described it there in that clip as the wake that comes behind him. There's a wake, and you have to be ready to do that. Now, you ask the proper question on, like, how do you handle that? Are you equipped to handle it? Do you have a strategy in place to handle that? This is not a local story anymore. This is a national story every single day that Caleb Williams is part of your organization. We watched him go to a women's NCAA tournament game and create a world of discussion based on his phone case and the color of his nails, right? Like, every single week, there are going to be eyeballs and magnifying glasses and spotlights on every single movement that Caleb Williams makes in a way that generates conversation, in some ways controversy, and you have to be prepared to manage and handle all that. We've got specific examples in our past where we say the Bears didn't handle certain things very well. Patch.com week, right? Like, one that pops right to mind. Like, do you have the things in place that are going to help you manage all of this? Because it is going to be a massive spectacle. In addition to everything that Caleb Williams does as a football player, he is now sort of this national figure that everyone is going to have eyeballs on.
Great interview with Ryan Poles and good stuff on Caleb Williams. Dan, before we get out of here, I wanted to get your take on the athletics report from Mike Sando. He had this week in regards to the quarterback position after the Bears traded Justin Fields for a 2025 6th-round draft pick, which could become a 4th depending on how much Justin Fields plays in Pittsburgh. The quote is this: "They almost got bullied or gave up," an exec said. "Their asking price was probably too high initially, and then when they realized the seats got filled, they had to lower their ask. I don't understand why you would make that trade, because if somebody has an injury or doesn't get the quarterback they thought they had, they thought they were going to get, the ask will be higher."
Yeah, I get the sentiment. First of all, I will say that Mike Sando is one of my favorite reporters in the league because he is very well connected. We see him do the quarterback tiers every year, and they're usually pretty on point. And he's not a look at me guy. So none of the stuff that he reports is ever hey, I'm trying to get a flashy headlight. And this was part of a piece that went into all 32 teams and what happened during free agency. As it relates to the Bears trade of Fields, the word bullied struck me as something that was out of touch with what was happening here in Chicago, because you could have done a number of different things to try to leverage the asset that was Justin Fields for something that might have gotten you a greater return. But you're also managing a situation. And I think by just clearing the stage before Caleb Williams gets here, it gives you an opportunity to say, if it's a 6, if it's a 4, could we have turned it into a 3, whatever it is, like, is all of that waiting worth the other things that would have come with keeping Justin Fields around? The premise for me was always laughable, that the Bears should wait for somebody else's starting quarterback to get hurt and then try to pounce on desperation. Well, you're waiting on a hypothetical that may never occur. There's almost no examples in the NFL of a starting quarterback getting injured and somebody else giving up the farm to bring in a replacement. The only one I can think of is when Sam Bradford came to Minnesota after Teddy Bridgewater dislocated his knee and had that catastrophic injury on a practice field in training camp. So if you're sitting there on pins and needles waiting for some team to have its starting quarterback have a catastrophic, life-threatening injury so that someone's going to trade for Justin Fields, you're crazy. Also, Justin Fields is very system specific as the market for his services played out. So I don't know that any team with an injured starter in training camp is going to make Justin Fields their top target. Long way of saying that, like, could the Bears have maybe played this differently to have gotten more in return for Justin Fields? Yes, absolutely. Would it have been in their long-term benefit to do so? I'm not sure, because I think the peace of mind and the calm and all of the things that have come with making that separation when they did is going to be absolutely helpful and useful to getting Caleb Williams off on the right foot.
Look at how well they've responded to the post Justin Fields phase. Look at how almost, maybe we're looking for things, but how much more free and easy they've operated without having to parse or weigh every word carefully. I think sometimes trades in the NFL aren't about football. They're not about draft compensation. They're about unloading and just moving on and providing closure more than compensation. I think you saw it in Buffalo this week. I'm not comparing the personalities of a Stephon Diggs and Justin Fields, but the realities in those football offices were the same. They felt like they needed to move on from Stephon Diggs for whatever reason, so they were willing to take a $31 million cap hit and get a 2025 second-round pick next year's draft. Justin Fields didn't get the same type of compensation, but it was the same kind of rationale. They were better off without him in the organization, and they needed to move on regardless of, even if they were willing to take less in return just to provide that kind of closure.
Look, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it also just feels like the temperature of everything has come down in our market and our landscape since the trade was made. It diffused what had become a very irrationally explosive conversation, and now you just feel that, like, whew, thank God that's behind us, right?
Without a doubt, and that's important. And we'll finish the way we started. When Ryan Poles talks about, when he's speaking to you and when he's speaking generally about how Chicago is different, it's one of these markets that everything is hypercharged and everything is magnified. That's why the vetting process for Caleb Williams is so exhaustive, and that's why you had to move on from Justin Fields when they did, because it was untenable to have both those guys here at the same time, and it wouldn't be fair to either one to draft Caleb Williams and have Justin Fields still part of the organization when you did it. They did what they had to do. They took less than what they wanted. they didn't get bullied at all. I think it was pragmatic and it was practical. And I think that comment seemed to come from somebody who was unfamiliar with the climate in Chicago.
No question. And you are very familiar with the climate in Chicago, which today we're finally getting some sun and some temperatures that might hint at baseball season being just around the corner, right?
Yeah, I'm tired of the Cubs playing in bear weather. That's kind of a bad idea, but they're winning anyway. So, all right. So that wraps it up for this episode of the Take the North podcast. You can get it on your free Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast, and you can watch us on 670 Scores YouTube page. We'll be back next week to talk about whatever is next, because there's plenty of stuff to discuss. There's a stadium project, which check out Sunday Chicago Tribune for an editorial as far as what the Bears are doing on the lakefront. A lot of conversations, some meetings behind the scenes. We'll be here next week to talk about it all. So for Adam Sadinsky and Dan Wiederer, I am David Haugh. Thanks for listening to the Take the North podcast.
Great talk. See you out there.